Thank you for joining us today. My name is Andrew Friedman. I'm the Executive Director for the Coalition for Cannabis Policy, Education, and Regulation. The coalition is comprised of both highly regulated businesses and a diverse group of stakeholders, from public safety to public health to social equity advocates and dozens of other experts who are here to engage in a national conversation on developing policy solutions on how to get cannabis legalization right at the federal level. Today, in that vein, we released a white paper on advancing opportunities for both small businesses and minority-owned businesses in a federally legalized cannabis industry. Today's roundtable is here to focus on just that, and we have an amazing set of panel of experts who I will allow to introduce themselves. But to guide that discussion, we have the amazing Shanita Penny, who is the founder of Budding Solutions, the former president of the Minority Cannabis Business Association, and all-around superstar thought leader in the world of cannabis legalization. She is a senior advisor to the coalition and a member of the Center of Excellence. Shanita, take it away.
Thank you, Andrew. Before we get started, I'd like to note that this event is being recorded and is open to the press. If you're a member of the media, please email press@cpair.org for any follow-up inquiries. Now it's my pleasure to introduce our panel of experts who will share just a little bit about themselves and their work. I'll start with you, Genine.
Thank you so much, Shanita. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me. My name is Genine Coleman, and I'm the Executive Director and founder of Origins Council. We're a 501c4 advocacy, research, and education organization based in California. And we support sustainable rural economic development for historic cannabis producing regions. And we're partnered with regional trade associations across California. And we represent largely small independent operators, predominantly small farmers, cultivating a 1/4 acre of cannabis licensed in California. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you, Genine. Next up, we've got Jeannette Horton.
Great to be here and with these other panelists. Thanks for having this topic. I'm Jeannette Ward Horton, and I am CEO of an organization called NuLeaf Project. We're a nonprofit. Our mission specifically is to build intergenerational wealth for the communities, the Black and Brown communities most harmed by the war on drugs. We do this practically by lobbying for cannabis policy, as well as supporting cannabis businesses owned by Black and Brown entrepreneurs. And we spend a lot of time funding businesses. We've funded businesses across the country, and over 500,000 and counting, majority Black and Brown owned businesses in cannabis.
Thank you, Jeannette. And Stephen Michael.
Thanks, Shanita. Stephen Michael, I'm the Executive Director of Main Street Alliance. We're a network of over 30,000 small business owners from around the country. We work as an organization to elevate the real voices of small business owners on public policy issues that impact their business, their employees, their families, and communities. And we're just thrilled to be a part of this conversation. Thanks so much.
Thank you all. And we'll just go ahead and get right into it. Small and minority-owned businesses are the foundation for a nationwide economic ecosystem that allows entrepreneurs to grow a business and investments. On his first day in office, President Biden issued an executive order to advance racial equity for underserved communities, acknowledging the opportunities and challenges we face as a country and the responsibility of our government to affirmatively advance equity, civil rights, racial justice, and equal opportunity. Both the nascent nature of the cannabis industry and the history of victimizing communities of color provide a unique opportunity to help improve the government's overall approach to encouraging small business growth and enhancing opportunity for minority entrepreneurs. Stephen, through the work you've done with small businesses outside the cannabis industry, your study found that small business owners want effective, equitable, and active government support for a thriving small business sector. Though this preference may run counter to conventional wisdom, it reflects the priorities and day-to-day reality of real small business owners across geography, race, gender, and even political affiliation. How important is it to have small business owners at the policy-making table?
Thanks, Shanita. So, entrepreneurship is heralded in this country as a path to opportunity. And yet it's really only through government efforts that we can really see a more equitable economy. We've seen like the economy that we exist in, that exists today is designed, really to support a very small minority of the super elite, often old white male business owners. And so from our perspective, it is really only through government efforts that we can create a more equitable economy that really centers on racial justice. That entrepreneurship really can contribute to intergenerational wealth, financial security, and prosperous local economies. But really too often, there's this undue and unbalanced influence of money in politics and in this space, and a lot of that is due to this corporate consolidation of power. And too often, policies are designed to support large multinational corporations, but passed in the name of small business. And so from our perspective, it's critical to have those most impacted actual small business owners at the policymaking table. So then small business aren't just a talking point for passing policy. We're actually doing things that create real equitable solutions to the problems that our country and our economy and our communities are facing. And in order to really address those policy solutions, those structural reforms that we need that really get at the inequities in our communities, as well as starting to tackle the structural and institutional racism and sexism that we've been talking about so far, we need to have those most impacted at the decision-making table, and really through engaging small business owners, especially BIPOC business owners and women business owners who have been systematically left out of both public programs as well as private market solutions, in particular with access to capital. It is just ever more important now to have folks at the policymaking table. So then it's not just elected officials or lobbyists that are writing, or corporate lobbyists for that matter, that are writing policy that supports big corporations, really in the name of small business. And that's kind of our whole reason for existence, is creating those kind of opportunities and making sure that small business owners get their own voices heard.
Thank you for that. I wanted to start with you because I wanted to, really point to the fact that this isn't a cannabis, regulatory and legislative policy making conversation. This is the conversation that has to be had as it relates to bringing all stakeholders to the table when we're talking about policy. Genine, California is somewhat unique in that it established and developed a robust pre-regulated cannabis market under medical compassion laws, entirely comprised of independent small operators. Were these small business owners engaged in cannabis policy reform? And how successful has the state been in transitioning those legacy operators into the regulated market?
Thank you, Shanita. And I really couldn't agree more with your points, Stephen. It absolutely has been an incredible process in California. The first legislative proposal that was on the table in 2014 proposed a very limited licensure framework, particularly for cultivation. They were proposing 5 cultivation licenses statewide. And the industry has been extraordinarily engaged and moved the dial in an incredible fashion. There was an industry white paper that was released in 2018, right at the dawn of rolling out regulation and licensing in California, that estimated our state had 60,000 cultivators statewide under the medical cannabis framework. And, largely these have been independent small businesses that have moved forward into licensing and really engaged through local trade associations. California is a very large state, and we've got 58 counties. The constructs under the medical cannabis framework and currently under the regulatory and licensing framework are really premised on a local control model. So circumstances are very unique from county jurisdiction to jurisdiction. And so we see a lot of the community and industry organizing really framed around regional organizing. And that's been a really important framework for advocacy to really help bridge really the local policy constructs with the state policy constructs So now we see a license framework that has around 6,000 cultivation licenses statewide. And so we're seeing about, a 10% attrition rate in terms of transition into the regulated market. The challenges that we're facing really come down to how land use is framed. And that's true both for cultivation sector and for the retail sector. We're going to talk more about that a little bit later, but that's one of the main barriers to entry that we're facing. But in terms of engagement on policy development over the past 5 years, it's been an extraordinary process, particularly in terms of legislative constructs. We also have a combined construct in California, right, with the legislative frameworks and then Proposition 64. And the confluence of those two constructs has become a little bit of a challenge because the legislative constructs allow for that representative governance engagement in terms of the industry with the representatives and really kind of refining the proposals as we're going and implementing. Working with the proposition has been a little bit of a challenge in terms of amending the proposition. So I think that's a really interesting consideration for those states that are moving forward with constructs. I think that the legislative framework really provides that opportunity for stakeholders to be at the table and really engage in depth and address specific needs to their sector and to their jurisdiction. So it's been a really incredible process to see how engaged and educated our industry has become with respect to policy advocacy. And I think that's been an incredible outcome of this process here in California. And I really look forward to seeing where it goes from here.
Thank you. It's imperative that public, private, and social stakeholders collaborate to reform laws and provide innovative solutions, as well as tap into existing programs to create equitable opportunities and outcomes. In lieu of access to agencies like the SBA, Jeannette, please walk us through changing Oregon laws as well as, other states that you've been involved in, and then also standing in the gap to build generational wealth for Black and Brown people through the legal cannabis industry.
Yeah, I think, your question was packed. It was a good one because we, definitely are trying to do something in Oregon that does stand in the gap. I like that wording, standing in the gap. And Stephen really spoke to it eloquently. I'll echo Genine. I appreciate that setup and Stephen's eloquent response because it really encapsulates what we're trying to do. We recognize and that community groups and impacted members of the community are rarely at the table. So we came together last year, July, really after we saw, Breonna Taylor specifically for me was proof that the war on drugs is still alive and well, and in the worst possible way, So it's still, cannabis was actually one of the things they were looking for in their warrant, their no-knock search warrant. So we definitely have a war on drugs that we're still facing and that still impacts Black communities more than others. And so we got together as a work group as members of the impacted community. We had people arrested for cannabis, people who had their records expunged, people who hadn't been able to, folks who were small business owners who were trying to make it work, but generational wealth being such that it is, we're hitting those roadblocks. And we came together to say, what can we do and what can we do with cannabis taxes? And how can cannabis taxes stand in the gap? And we thought about that gap broadly. You said, Shanita, this wasn't about cannabis. It's not just about cannabis. We were thinking about that gap for Black and Brown businesses broadly. In Oregon specifically, less than 5 Black businesses have gotten SBA loans in the last 10 years. That's the yearly average, less than 5. It's, in my opinion, absurd. We fund businesses and we get businesses every day, cannabis and non-cannabis, who are viable, wonderful businesses looking for funding. We don't have enough funding to give them. So we were saying cannabis taxes can stand in that gap. We've got growing cannabis taxes in Oregon, and we can come together as community members and demand where our taxes go and say there's a good use for this taxes that builds our communities by funding small businesses that don't usually get funded. Black and Brown small businesses, that changes generational wealth in a significant way. Stephen already spoke to it. So, we're trying to do that really good work, and we believe cannabis taxes can do that. we've hit roadblocks. We have a bill that's called the Equity Investment Act. It's HB 3112. And doing this kind of change work is hard. Barack Obama said hard things are hard. And we're hitting, as Stephen has said, we're hitting moneyed interests who like the system as it is, right? The system was designed to do exactly what it was designed to do. So we're trying to disrupt, and we're trying to do a disruption, though, that is good for our communities, right? Raising all boats, saying, let's build more successful entrepreneurs. And you know what they need? Capital. And we can source that capital, and we can help them grow. And you know what? That grows our economy, and that grows taxes. And it's a win-win if we can take off, frankly, sometimes racial blinders. So we're trying to do that with this work in Oregon. And other states are doing similar models, saying we can set aside these cannabis taxes, and we're really just trying to do that work. So yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. It's been a pleasure doing this work with you over the last several years. And to your point, when you get it right for the most impacted, right, all boats rise. And so it's important that we keep that in mind if we are really talking about, like you said, disrupting. Genine, I want to go back to California for a minute. This week, the legislature approved a $100 million plan to provide grants to cities and counties to help cannabis businesses transition from provisional to regular licenses. 5 years after voters approved Prop 64, entrusting the legislature with creating a legal, well-regulated cannabis market. Your organization predominantly represents the cultivation sector in California. Many of these operators are struggling to make the transition from a provisional temporary license to a permanent one that's renewed on an annual basis. This process requires a costly, complicated, and time-consuming review of the negative environmental effects involved in a business and a plan for reducing those harms. What regulatory approaches should federal policymakers be thinking about in order to support independent small businesses in participating in the cultivation sector?
Thank you, Shanita. Yeah, this goes back to the land use regulation issue. And California has extraordinarily robust environmental regulatory protections, which we're very proud of. And we also, in rolling out our cannabis, particularly cultivation, licensing, and regulatory framework, really built upon that history and created even more robust protections regarding water use and water rights and environmental protections. Our organization is very supportive of all of these constructs. Where the challenge comes in is in terms of implementation. And so one of the really kind of primary considerations in California and for other states to consider, particularly with the hemp being regarded as an agricultural crop on the national level, that's really where there's a divergence between how cannabis is regulated in California versus hemp broadly nationally. It is not regarded as an agricultural crop in California, and therefore it's really regulated from a land use perspective as though it's development. And for California, again, referencing our historic 60,000 producers statewide, there was a very robust existing footprint from an environmental baseline perspective. And, really transitioning those legacy operators into the license framework is really mitigating historic impacts of unregulated production and, frankly, other impacts on legacy production sites. And for California, there's a lot of historic impacts from the history of logging, for example. And so regulation is really a tremendous tool to mitigate historic environmental impacts on these rural parcels. But the cost, expense, and complexity of it becomes a real barrier to entry. And so we've seen this proposal come forward from the governor's administration to really try and address the challenges that we're faced because of the way that land use is regulated. And so I think, this is a conversation that is really important to frame with respect to the trajectory of ultimately interstate, national, and international regulated full supply chain and commerce, and really thinking about policy constructs from the international level flowing downward, and really framing cannabis and hemp in a comparable way in terms of land use regulation and also product quality testing standards if ultimately the production is for the purpose of human consumption. And so we're really working to try and bring those two plants together. They are one plant, both in terms of production standards, but in terms of the overall regulatory framework and how to support production in a way that's sustainable from an environmental perspective, but in a way that's in reach for small independent operators. And, I think it's, you use the word, Jeannette, of disruption, and I love that concept. And I think we have an opportunity to look at agribusiness and the larger constructs of sustainability for the United States. And I think cannabis is an incredible opportunity for policy reform and looking at, revolution of small farmers and how to really transition into a more sustainable model for our food, our medicine, and our fiber production. And so these are really the pieces that are coming to the fore with the challenges we're seeing with this framing of cannabis production as a development, when in fact, first and foremost, many of these sites were existing production and they are very small, largely farms that we're representing, again, quarter acre of production and homestead farms. And so, really considering, I think the implementation impacts is a really kind of an interesting space in terms of rolling out legalization and really doing the work after those constructs are in place to assess how well they're really meeting the goals, right, in implementation. And so there's a lot of opportunity for reform. And I think that we're seeing awareness broadly within the state in terms of policymakers on the state and local level and what's working and what's not, and an appetite for reform on that level.
Thank you. Stephen, I want to talk a little bit about how critical it is to balance the public and private sectors as we create solutions. What role should government play in creating an equitable economy?
Thanks, Shanita. And I'm really appreciating this conversation so far. I feel like there's just a lot of great things that have been said. Over the past several years, really, we've been kind of wrestling with this question a lot. Is like, what is the government's role in creating an equitable economy? What do small business owners really need? What are small business owners calling for from government involvement, both at the local, state, and federal level? And the pandemic really exposed a lot of tears in our social safety nets, public programs that really highlighted the extreme gulf of understanding between what policymakers believe about our communities and believe about small businesses and believe about our economy and the reality, the lived experience of small business owners. And it really created an opportunity, an unprecedented opportunity that unlike we've seen before, to educate decision makers about the realities, about what small businesses need to thrive, both in the cannabis industry and outside. Like we talked about, our organization works with a wide variety of industries and really works to think about elevating a different way to think about business. And so we work with small business owners who believe that an investment in their employees is an investment in their business, who are making investments in their communities as investments in their business because they rely on the local strength of the strength of the local economy for their own success, which is in sharp contrast to like the big multinational corporations that are dealing on a global level. And when we're spending dollars at local shops, then it keeps money local, and when we're spending dollars at big multinational online platforms, that goes straight out of the community. And so like we have really seen this opportunity to kind of tell a different story, but there just remains a strong disconnect from things that we're hearing in conversations we're having with folks around the country. There's this like common idea, this general perception of who small business owners are. And it's this image of conservative, rich, older, white, male, cisgendered, straight people who like this is this idea of who small business owners are. And there's this idea that all small businesses, want no government involvement. They want no taxes. They want no regulations. They want to think about their employees like line items on their budget. And this is just wrong. This is this idea. This is this narrative that's been driven by large corporations, by big multinationals that we've talked about the influence that money can have in politics, that are spending millions of dollars lobbying to keep things the way that they are. And so through the pandemic, we've had a lot of really great conversations. We did a poll, actually, kind of what we thought at the time was maybe near the end. Last fall of 2020, we did a poll of small business owners, really getting at this question. Should government play a role in creating an equitable economy? And 2/3 of folks that responded, 2/3 of small business owners felt that the federal government in particular had a role to protect small businesses and create a more equitable economy. And in a period of such polarization and divisiveness, it really seems like this is a really unifying idea. There's support across race, across gender, party identification, geography, business size, and sector. And we really have an opportunity like no other to really rebuild our economy, to build a new economy with small businesses to the center. And we can address these fractures in our societal infrastructure that deepened systemic disparities over the last year. But we have to be intentional about that. And it's not something that the private market can just deal with on its own. It's something that government needs to have a role in. We feel like there's an opportunity for this new economy to really rethink what kinds of public investments need to be made, and how we spend our dollars. And I love what what Jeannette was talking about in really thinking about how we're using tax revenue to reinvest in our communities, and in the communities that have been hit hardest by this 50-year war on drugs that we see. This week is a 50-year anniversary of the war on drugs, right?
Go ahead. You froze for a second, but please finish.
Oh, I'm sorry. My internet is. Public investments like broadband are really important as well. Things like in our rural communities, but small businesses that we're talking to and working with, that we're hearing more and more from, we're really their own ideas are counter to this general idea, this kind of common understanding of what small businesses need. They're proud to pay their fair share of taxes that support smart public investments, in critical infrastructures like paid family medical leave, like healthcare, like childcare, like broadband and roads and bridges and schools. But we need that revenue, and we need an equitable tax code to ensure that there's that revenue to make those kinds of investments. And I think the other piece, and I think the role that the government can play in creating a more equitable economy is really around access to capital. We've seen the same kind of redlining in small business lending that we saw in the housing market around race and gender. Older white male business owners who are already banked, already have good banking relationships, had no problem accessing public programs like the PPP. But most small business owners of color that were unbanked or that didn't have existing banking relationships with folks that operate through the 7A loan program couldn't access that economic relief. And so we really need to think about how we're structuring government policies, what agencies we're using, how we're engaging small business owners in dialogue and in conversation, in both crafting policies, but also we were hearing Genine talk about implementation of policies. And I think lots of times we get to a point where there's a good piece of legislation that gets passed, or a piece of legislation that gets passed, and a lot of our lawmakers kind of do a checkbox and like, cool, we dealt with that problem. And that's not the reality. We need to implement things, and the government needs to invest resources in ensuring that there's education and an outreach that goes to small business owners and meets folks where they're at. Because while some folks have been able to adapt and operate online and engage and kind of access information digitally, not everybody can. And the most impacted communities can't. And so we need to go meet folks where they're at in person and have these real conversations. And we should use public dollars to support that. And so, you know, I feel like there's just so much that we've learned. Like we're in such a different place economically and socially today than we were at the beginning of the pandemic. And there's just such a different light that's being shown on so many inequities in our economy and in our society that we have a real opportunity to address if we're engaging folks at the table and if we're ensuring that we're holding our elected officials accountable to do the things that they say they're going to do. So I know I can, you know, get on my soapbox a little bit, but we're, you know, really passionate about this and feel like there's definitely a huge role that the government can play in creating a new economy. Yeah, thanks for that question, Shanita. I appreciate it.
Well, I appreciate your response, and it's a perfect segue into a question I have for Jeannette. You know, both the MORE Act and the Safe Banking Act begin to address the goal of closing the racial funding gap, and the federal government should look to Black-owned banks to help fill the capital access gap because they tend to be naturally community-oriented and best positioned to make immediate impacts in the communities they serve. The federal government should also consider the role of minority depository institutions and community development financial institutions as a bridge to supporting historically underserved communities. In addition to the US Treasury recently awarding $1.25 billion to CDFIs to support economic relief in underserved communities affected by COVID-19, Jeannette, what must the federal government do to fully realize the potential of CDFIs?
This isn't my idea at all. So I'm repeating things that have been written and said by other people. And it's one of the things that I learned recently about CDFIs, just really learning how the money flows and that SBA loans flow through them, and that the SBA controls the number of CDFIs and who's approved to be a CDFI, what institutions are approved. And not many of those institutions are run by people of color. Not many are in rural areas. Not many are Black run. And I think I feel it's important to call that out specifically. And when you see them being Black led or in rural communities, you find that they lend more to Black businesses and rural businesses. And they, you know, that's the work I think the SBA has immediately in front of it and easily in front of it, is to make a concerted effort to create some equity amongst CDFIs, to get more CDFIs that are BIPOC run, BIPOC focused, or have really strong track records of equitable lending to BIPOC or businesses. And that would flip, when I say equitable, I mean that would flip the dynamic that you see today, because today you see that you know, SBA loans go to 10% or worse, depending on which loan you're talking about. Businesses of color, Black-owned businesses, it usually is about 3% or worse. So that's got to be changed. And in a Black-run organization, you'll see, like, we loan over 50% of our funds, whether grants or loans, our businesses are over 50% are Black-owned. And then the other 45% are BIPOC owned. And there's just more success in terms of our outreach and who we're trying to find and who we network with and who we know. Stephen talked about the relationships that existing relationships people have with banks. And it's, you know, not necessarily, we're not, you know, no one's saying anyone's a racist. We're saying it's relationships. It's the way things have been dug in and done. And you need new institutions with different relationships that balance out the mix.
I couldn't have said it better myself, Jeannette. I totally agree. You know, as we think about what's happening real time here, you know, there's a movement and a renewed focus on, you know, leveling the playing field. And we can't talk about addressing access to capital in the cannabis industry if we aren't talking about addressing access to capital generally. Genine, our paper talks about exploring meaningful partnerships and the potential for symbiotic relationships between small or minority-owned businesses and national and multinational businesses. One of the examples included in our paper is Constellation Brands' $100 million commitment to invest in minority-owned businesses in the beverage alcohol space over the next 10 years. The first direct investment was made by acquiring a stake in Lafite du Rose, and I probably mispronounced that, a premium rosé founded in 2019 by Danae Burston, a beverage alcohol industry vet and the first Black business owner with a Province rosé to his name. I bring up this example because it relates directly to some of the work you're doing in California. Please explain California's new appellations law and the opportunities it presents for legacy cannabis farmers.
Thank you, Shanita. This is my favorite topic, so thank you for bringing it forward. Part of our mission has been to establish legal protections for products of place, so geographic indication systems for cannabis. It is an old construct and even more meaningful, I think, in today's world. And so it's an intellectual property construct that really flows from a regulatory authority. It's for products of place that are produced and have a special quality that's really derived from the agricultural practices of a specific region, the genetic resources of that specific community, and the quality and characteristics of the product that are derived from that confluence. And so everyone is familiar with products such as champagne or Parma ham. These are, wonderful, renowned products that really bring renown back to the region. It has a confluence of deliverables in terms of being able to represent the culture and the values of a producing community through the label of a product. And so it's a way to communicate to the consumer and add value through the whole supply chain that really relates and gives back to these rural producing communities. And so California has been working for the past 5 years, and our organization and stakeholders have been really engaged in developing really what's been a farmer-driven movement to establish the world's first legal appellation of origin system for cannabis. And so we've been working with legislature over the past 5 years to really develop a robust system that's akin to the system that's in place in Europe, and that can really bring a substantive value to producers eventually in the international market. And I think it's a really important construct from a policy perspective when we think about traditional farming communities and we look at the global footprint of cannabis historically as a crop that has been meaningful and a part of the farming heritage of communities all over the world, and a way to protect these traditional farming communities as their countries move forward into a legalized framework. It's a way to protect cultural resources, genetic resources, and ensure that there is a meaningful place at the table in the market for these traditional producers. And one of the most important, I think, values of it is because the premise is really based on the place, it's a way to protect land holdings for smallholders. And I think that is an incredibly important point, particularly for the production sector of traditional farming communities as we move forward into a globalized economy for cannabis. And it really ties the value of the product to the soil underneath the farmer's feet and really strengthens their holdings for generational wealth and really carrying the values and the history of those particular cultures forward into the regulated sector. And so it's a very powerful tool. It's got a lot to offer in terms of an array of intellectual property protections and marketing strengths. And so it's a multifaceted tool and one that we're very proud to have set this precedent here in California, and really look forward to supporting other states and countries in moving forward with similar protections for their farming communities.
Thank you so much for sharing that information. And, the other point I would like to make as it relates to efforts like these is, we don't have to always reinvent the wheel. We can take, what's working well in other industries, and we should be applying it. We should fully leverage opportunities that we know are working. And, with that being said, Jeannette, I'd love to hear you weigh in, because we talked about the appellations in California, but, this is also something that is going to be beneficial for our craft cultivators in general. Talk to us about what's happening in Oregon with the farmers there.
Yeah, I was just thinking about all the places this could be applied to. So certainly Oregon, and there's a strong craft history here and tradition here. But I was also thinking of Jamaica and what this might do. I was thinking where is there a community of color for whom this might be a very useful tool. So yeah, a lot of light bulbs are going off, Janine, as you were sharing that. I like that a lot. It's very happy to be able to copy the work that you guys have done and think about other places that's going to be very beneficial.
Absolutely. We are going to move into some questions that have been submitted from our audience. And, Genine, I'm going to start with you. How do protections for small farmers benefit consumers downstream?
Absolutely. Well, I think it's important to note that cannabis is really a specialized product. It's, very complex chemically, right? There's about 400 active constituents that we're aware of right now. And so it's ripe for, a specialized craft consumer market, but it's also a medicine, right? So that's a balance that we think about striking in terms of building something like an appellation system, which is really designed to elevate the value of the product and the cost of the product to the consumer, and how to strike a balance. There's a really interesting example with Manuka honey in New Zealand, and they have a geographic indication protection status for Manuka honey, but they've also worked to integrate it into the local medical access system, right? So consciousness around it as a medicine and ensuring that access is equitable. And I think, with cannabis, it's a very responsive plant in terms of the environment. It's a bioremediator, right? And so where it's grown, how it's produced is very important, I think, particularly for the medical cannabis consumer. And so appellations are a really kind of interesting system because it really goes into the very detail and regulation of production standards, inputs, right, that farmers are using, and how that really affects the expression of the plant and those unique constituents that consumers and particularly patients may find particularly useful. And so I think, as we're looking at cannabis as a product for human consumption and production standards and product quality standards, that's a tremendous value add and deliverable to the consumer. And to be able to really get to know a product and the producing community behind it and all the standards and care and practices that are going into that product, I think is a tremendous value for the consumer. So I really look forward to that playing out, in the marketplace and having the consumer really drive the demand for this kind of care into production regulation and standards.
Absolutely. Stephen, how can small businesses get involved with influencing federal regulations?
Oh man, lots of different ways. You can call your members of Congress, and that's a big thing you could do. There are a number of organizations like ours too that that do this similar kind of work. I would say that I'm sure my contact information can be made available if there are particular small business owners that are interested in getting involved. We work. We've got members in every 50 state, all of the 50 states in the U.S. and really work across issues, across industry, like I said, and so there's all kinds of different ways. Another key thing that we usually try to do is we're trying to create a new narrative, and so getting your voice heard, telling your story, putting your own personal experience out there through traditional media, through social media. It's really connecting what happens in policy to your own personal experience is really critical to demonstrate the need and also to continue to elevate the gaps, because no policy is ever going to be perfect, and there's always going to need to be changes, and there's always going to be different pieces to address. And so I guess the real short answer is, get in touch with an organization like ours, Main Street Alliance. We work really hard to make those kinds of connections. And I'm happy to talk to, anybody or have any of our staff to do that.
I'd like to get your thoughts, Genine, Stephen, Jeannette, on how important it is for, the cannabis industry certainly has our organizations, but then, Main Street Alliance, the organizations like Main Street Alliance exist. How important is it for us to be working together from various industries?
Well, I'm happy to jump in, and I think it's absolutely essential. I think it's part of normalizing for us the cannabis industry and really broadening our stakeholder base and our coalition opportunities. We've had the pleasure of working, for example, in California with the wine industry around the appellation issue, and that's been incredible. We're currently working with the environmental community around these land use issues, and I think it's just essential. I couldn't emphasize how important it is more. I think that, together we can really disrupt, right? And find these shared interests and really combine our vision and our collective resources and really move the needle. Cannabis is a tremendous opportunity, right, to make much, much more global changes that are absolutely ripe right now.
Thank you. Okay, here's a question for Jeannette or Shanita. And Jeannette, I'll toss it to you first. As graduates of HBCUs or historically Black colleges and universities, how do you see these institutions supporting efforts to empower entrepreneurs and help companies?
That's a great question. I mean, HBCUs are wonderful places. I was going to say obviously, but maybe if you don't know them, you don't know it's obvious. They're wonderful places to find bright, talented African Americans eager to change the world. I went to Spelman College, so I'll give mine a shout out. I think that's the new slogan, is like, go change the world. It's really, just the best and the brightest if you haven't met any HBCU folks. That said, it makes sense to bring resources around the cannabis industry, the opportunities in the industry, to those spaces. And I think as we advance education and what we know about the plant and the science, I think that's going to be a really important space to educate and hopefully do the work that research universities and those programs do as well, and do that with BIPOC folks leading that out of HBCU. So that would be pretty amazing. Those would be my thoughts about how HBCUs could get involved.
I second everything that you said. As a proud alum of North Carolina A&T State University, a land grant institution, the very institutions that are creating a pipeline of diverse talent for almost every industry that you can think of, as well as policy. When you look at the makeup of the Congressional Black Caucus, you will see ties to most of our HBCUs. So for me, it's important that we do the right things, that we are legislating equitably so that we have the support of institutions like the HBCUs, because the one thing they are designed to do is to protect the very people that were harmed by the war on drugs. And it's not going to be easy to engage these institutions if we aren't doing it in a responsible manner. So I love that question. Thank you, Jeannette. I wanted to make sure that we highlighted some of these other institutions that we should be thinking about as we explore partnerships to create an equitable ecosystem nationally. And I'm gonna go to one more question, and this one is for you, Stephen. Is there a peer-reviewed data set that shows the breakdown of small business ownership by race, ethnicity, to use as a reference for the current conversation points?
Yes, there's a number of data sets that are available through the SBA, and there's they do a lot of collection. One of the big challenges is that data collection on race and ethnicity has there's a history of that being not as inclusive and expansive as it needs to be. And so one of the things that we do work on also is making sure that more data is collected and reviewed and publicized as well. But I'm happy to share whatever data sets we've got that we use. I'm sure that there's other folks on this call too that have access to similar kinds of things.
Thank you. And you've all been so gracious and shared so much with us, but I would like to just give you each an opportunity to make any additional points or leave us with any last words.
Well, I'd love to just say I really appreciate being invited into this panel. It's been an incredibly inspiring conversation, and I really appreciate all the work that you're doing and this venue and opportunity to have this conversation. And I really would love to support your efforts more and continue the dialogue. I think that it's a very critical juncture for our country, and I think we've got tremendous opportunity. And so I really want to applaud all of your efforts.
Thank you, Genine. All right. Well, as we wrap up today's discussion, we would like to thank Genine Coleman, Jeannette Ward Horton, and Professor Robert Mikos for useful discussions, feedback, and reviewing our initial drafts of this paper. We also thank Stephen Michael and Main Street Alliance for curating the conversation with small business owners that inform how regulatory structures are perceived by the small business community. Of course, we must also thank everyone for tuning in. And if you have any questions about today's discussion, please reach out to the coalition at press@cpair.org. You can email the coalition at press@cpair.org. Again, thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to continuing this conversation and work with you.